A horror movie, like a comedy, is a very, very easy thing to screw up. I mean, all someone has to say to articulate why they didn't like your movie after all is just, well, that wasn't scary. But even when a horror movie fails at its every ambition, it doesn't mean that that ambition can't birth some really fun moments, like, for example, some great creative death scenes. So with that in mind, I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are amazing death scenes wasted in terrible horror movies. The Bus Massacre, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022. The latest installment in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise is an absolute nonsense movie, but boy, does it have some inventive kills. And that's partly thanks to this version of Leatherface being a total monster, somehow entering his serial killer prime at 70 years old. In this movie, he'll snap a man's arm and then skewer him in the neck with the dislodged bone without even breaking a sweat, and it is admittedly pretty damn sick. Perhaps the MVP of this terrible movie's annoyingly good kill ideas, though, is the massacre on the party bus. Here, a bunch of insufferable, poorly written millennials party under bright blue neon lights, that is, until Leatherface gets on board, a chainsaw in tow. And in the tight, narrow lane of the bus, there's nowhere for people to run or hide. Consequently, tens of victims are ripped apart, limbs flying everywhere, and intestines strewn across the seats. It's chaotic and devilishly fun, and it doesn't take long for the once blue bus to become a hazy shade of crimson. Head exploded by tire. Rubber. Rubber, more than any other entry on this list, seems deeply, almost uncomfortably aware of the fact that it is bad. The whole thing feels like the schlocky horror movie equivalent of Jean-Luc Godard's King Lear, that being a gigantic middle finger to both everyone who thought this turkey was a good idea, as well as anyone who actually paid money to see it. And fittingly, both movies also share the same level of quality, that being, they're not very good. But unlike Godard's King Lear, Rubber has a tire that telekinetically explodes people's heads, so I do think it's safe to say which is the superior picture. The tire at the center of this mayhem dispatches a lot of people this way, but the last one is by far the funnest. After seemingly finally being rid of the thing by distracting it with NASCAR and then shooting it with a shotgun, the tire, to quote the final victim of the movie, is reincarnated as a tricycle. Now that he's 3 tires instead of 1, naturally this means that he's unstoppable, which he proves by promptly exploding the old man and riding off. The film ends almost immediately afterwards, which was the correct move because no other note would have been appropriate for this strange little movie. Mauled to death by bats, the Abominable Dr. Phibes. The Abominable Dr. Phibes is up there with the incredibly strange creatures who stopped living and became mixed up zombies as one of the all-time great bad horror movies. It's a movie so charmingly abysmal that you can't help but love it, and that's thanks to his brilliant use of Vincent Price and balls-to-the-wall attitude towards horror. One of the most memorable parts is when the eponymous Dr. Phibes gets his revenge on one of our unlucky victims of the evening by sending a bunch of bats to maul him in his sleep. Now, I should mention that nothing is done to these bats to make them more feral or to even make him more appetizing to them. These bats were apparently just on the exact same page as Phibes and felt that this a-hole just had to go. So when the guy lays down to sleep, he opens his eyes to find several dozen bats crawling and landing on him. These freaking bats then proceed to tear the poor guy apart, and it is awesome. Man, I love Halloween. Run over by a steamroller, Maximum Overdrive. Stephen King movies are rarely great, but even the bad ones have their charm due to being born from such an imaginative mind. And no better example of this exists than Maximum Overdrive. Now, one could argue that this movie is not meant to be scary, and indeed, no film with a soundtrack composed by freaking AC/DC can possibly be intended to scare you. But the advertisements all said it was horror, so in that respect, it fails. But in terms of thrills and gore, well, this movie succeeds with flying colors. The most infamous example of this is when one of the machines that comes alive due to the events of the movie, in this case a steamroller, makes a pancake out of some poor kid. Most cuts of the movie don't show the whole thing, but even in the most cut version, you can clearly tell that the kid is very dead. It's sick, shocking, and everything you want in a good old-fashioned schlocky horror death scene. Cryo Freeze Skull, Jason X. Some kills are great despite the terrible movie that surrounds them, others are great because of the insanity that you've watched up to and after that point, and some just make watching the rest of the film pointless. You know, a kill so good that you may as well just turn off the movie right then, because there's no way that they'll top it. Well, in Jason X, the Friday the 13th series jumps the shark and flies right off into space, alongside the Leprechaun from Leprechaun and Pinhead from Hellraiser. And how does Jason celebrate his awakening into the final frontier? Why, the only way he knows how, of course. He spies a young blonde scientist next to where they're studying his remains, and wouldn't you know it, an open tub of liquid nitrogen is right there next to her. What serendipity! Like handing the history eraser button to someone and then asking them really nicely not to press it. Jason just can't help himself. He grabs the poor woman by the back of the head, shoves her head into the liquid nitrogen just long enough for her skull to freeze, and then smashes her skull open on the table. And yeah, you might as well just turn the film off after that, because there's no topping that one. Death by Reb Brown, Howling II. One of the all-time kings of 70s and 80s schlock was football player turned actor Reb Brown. So when Sony was making a schlocky, low-budget sequel to underrated werewolf gem The Howling, Reb was cast as the lead. Whereas the first Howling was a horror movie through and through, though, you don't cast Reb Brown in a movie unless he's gonna get to shoot a lot of people in the face, so the genre was shifted accordingly. When Reb gets recruited by Christopher Lee to help him hunt werewolves, their first stop is a cemetery, where Reb's sister is buried, but suspected of being about to come back to life thanks to her transformation into a lycanthrope. Now, normally this would be a chance for some good pathos, as Reb's character has to grapple with having to put a bullet in his sister's head so that she doesn't hurt anyone. But then, if this was a movie with pathos, it wouldn't have Reb Brown in it, so he just lets out one of his trademark glorious battle cries and pumps the zombie doggy full of lead. Very nice. Leeched to death while tied to a bed. Puppet Master. Puppet Master, the first installment of the flagship franchise from that venerated king of direct-to-video schlock Full Moon Pictures, is not that great. Or even all that good, if I'm being honest. The franchise wouldn't see its stride until the sequels, and even those were seriously hit and miss at times. But watching the first film does help you quickly figure out why this became such a long-running movie series. Beyond how cheap its central gimmick is to bring to life, the puppets offer a wide variety of cool ways to dispatch worthless, squishy human victims. The best of which belongs to one poor sucker who, while tied to the bed for some quality time with a quickly dispatched woman, gets instead some nice alone time with the sole female member of the puppets, Leech Woman. And yeah, no prizes for guessing what her whole deal is. Consequently, the poor guy could only watch as the Leech Woman crawls slowly on top of his tied down body, taking her time with prey that she knows can't run away. And then she sucks him dry until he dies of blood loss. It's brutal, but hey, there's no kink shaming here. Garbage Day, Silent Night, Deadly Night 2. Silent Night, Deadly Night was a series birthed in the craze of making holiday-themed slasher movies after John Carpenter proved that that formula could be a license to print money. While the first one is mostly forgotten, save for the hardcore bad horror movie geeks out there, Silent Night, Deadly Night 2 is more widely remembered for lovers of wonderfully terrible horror. And it's all because of one truly glorious line read. The movie centers around a troubled teen who goes on a murderous rampage throughout the film. And while the hokey acting makes for a lot of hilarious scenes, the one that everyone remembers is when he spies a random guy taking the trash out in the morning. Then, with a wild look in his eyes, he yells out, "Garbage Day," in the most insane way that a person could possibly say those two words, and then he shoots him, and we're just expected to move on after that. The scene leading up to this was mostly normal, so being suddenly slapped in the face with one of the goofiest line reads in the history of cinema, immediately followed by brutal gun violence, has cemented this scene in the horror nerd history books. Corn on the Cob, Sleepwalkers. When talking about memorable scenes in otherwise terrible horror movies, you're pretty much required by law to mention at some point the perfect amalgamation of amazing scenes in a movie that just doesn't work, simply known as Sleepwalkers. In its own way, this movie is a masterpiece. I mean, you will never have as much fun with a terrible film as you will with the greatest/worst thing Stephen King has ever put his name on. And the best example of everything this movie has to offer comes in one of the most wonderfully dumb death scenes in fiction. This kill comes at the the end of a long string of deaths, as one of the two eponymous sleepwalkers works her way through a house filled with dumbass cops until there's only one left calling for backup in the middle of the kitchen. Now, any other horror movie here would have had our monster look through the kitchen for any number of dangerous utensils, heavy cookware, or even a plate to break over his head. But since this is Sleepwalkers, she chooses the silliest possible option and rams a corn cob into the guy's back. And put simply, how can one not stand up and cheer at the sight of a man dying to a corn cob being shoved into his back with enough force to snap his spine into and kill him instantly? It's easily the best death scene ever to come from a terrible horror movie.